At 4:04 p.m. on May 29, 1943, 7 aircraft proved a terrifying truth about air war. Not about courage, not about marksmanship, not even about German fighters. About weight. Because somewhere over western France, a B-17 flying fortress, modified into what American engineers swore would be the ultimate answer, was doing the one thing it was never supposed to do. It was falling behind. And in the bomber war, falling behind wasn't a mistake. It was a death sentence. They called it a flying destroyer. A bomber converted into an escort gunship, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns like a porcupine made of steel. They thought it would protect the formation. Instead, it became the formation's most valuable lesson, and the irony is brutal. This program failed so spectacularly that it was cancelled in 10 combat missions. But one piece of that failure, one invention born from panic and desperation, ended up riding on thousands of bombers and changing the way the Luftwaffe attacked forever. This is the story of the YB-40, the bomber that tried to become a fighter, the escort that couldn't escort, and the innovation that survived the collapse, quietly saving crews long after the flying destroyer disappeared into scrap. By early 1943, the 8th Air Force was learning a hard law of physics. A bomber formation is only as strong as the moment it turns for home. Because getting to the target was painful. But leaving the target was worse. In the 3 months before May, American crews watched too many contrails appear at altitude on the return leg. They watched shadows drop through the sun. They watched bright flashes of 20mm cannon fire tear into aluminum and fabric and flesh. They called it the gauntlet. And it earned the name. The 8th Air Force had been throwing B-17s into Europe like a giant hammer. Daylight precision bombing, mass formations, the promise of industrial collapse. But without long-range escorts, those formations paid for every mile beyond friendly fighter range. German interceptors didn't have to win the war in one day. They only had to do one thing consistently, make every mission cost more than it could afford. Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from high noon, where a B-17's nose defenses struggled to track fast enough. Messerschmitt 109s dove through the formation like knives, picking off aircraft that drifted even slightly out of position. Some attacks were disciplined, textbook. Some were savage, almost personal. And every crew in that bomber stream understood the unspoken math. They were flying a machine designed to absorb punishment. But absorption has limits. Half of them didn't make 25 missions, not because they were weak, because the system was bleeding them out. So the question became simpler and darker every week. If fighters can't escort bombers all the way to Germany and back, what if the bomber escorted itself? What if you turned the bomber into the escort? It sounds insane. It also sounds exactly like the kind of idea that gets approved when your casualty lists become a weekly ritual. And that's how the flying destroyer was born. The concept wasn't subtle. Remove everything that doesn't shoot, and then make it shoot more. Engineers took a B-17F, already bristling with guns, and decided it wasn't enough. Not even close. Bombs were removed. The bombardier station was repurposed. A chin turret, twin 50s, was installed where men once looked down through glass and prayed the bombs would fall straight. A second dorsal turret was added behind the radio room. Single waist guns became twin mounts. Cheek guns were added, extra guns, forward fuselage. Ammunition capacity tripled to over 11,000 rounds. Armor plating was welded around positions where gunners had been dying. By the time it was finished, the aircraft wore 16 50 caliber machine guns. 16 on one airframe. It looked like a B-17 that had been bitten by an industrial nightmare and decided to bite back. They designated it YB-40, but crews didn't call it that. They called it what it felt like, the flying destroyer. And for a moment, the name didn't feel like propaganda. It felt like a promise. Because in photographs, the thing looked unstoppable, like a flying fortress that finally meant the fortress part. When the first conversions were completed, 12 of them, there was a quiet confidence in the brass. Not arrogance, relief. Because if you could escort bomber formations with bombers, then you didn't need fighters. Not yet. Not until the escort problem was solved, and maybe, just maybe, this new monster could bridge the gap. That's how the YB-40 arrived in England, and that's how a 26-year-old pilot named Captain James Hartwell became part of the experiment. At 11:47 a.m. on May 29, 1943, Hartwell climbed into the cockpit of his aircraft at RAF Alconbury. He watched the ground crew load the last belt of .50 caliber ammunition into what someone joked was the bomber's 17th gun position. He was 26 years old. He had flown 42 combat missions. He had zero experience flying what he was about to fly, because this wasn't simply a B-17 with more guns. This was a different animal. The YB-40 weighed roughly 4,000 pounds more than any flying fortress Hartwell had flown. It felt heavier in every movement. It had more drag, more armor, more ammunition, more everything. And the crew had a nickname for it already. Hedgehog. Because it looked like a steel beast covered in spikes. And because, if you were honest, it also looked like something built to survive by not being touched. Hartwell's flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison, 31 years old, had more hours inside a B-17 than most men had hours of sleep. Morrison wasn't the kind of man who got excited about new gear. He got suspicious. During the briefing, the aircraft commander who had flown Hedgehog mentioned a problem that stuck in Hartwell's mind like grit. The center of gravity felt wrong. Too much weight behind the bomb bay. That meant control didn't feel normal. It meant trim could be strange. It meant the aircraft might fly like it was arguing with itself. But the guns were hypnotic. The chin turret alone promised a solution to the Luftwaffe's favorite approach. Head-on attacks. 2 50s with a clean forward field of fire. No awkward angles. No blind spot at 12 o'clock high. No praying the cheek gunners could track fast enough. Every approach vector was covered. Every angle met overlapping fire. The mission brief was simple. Escort the main formation to Saint-Nazaire. Attack the submarine pens. 7 YB-40s would be placed in the most vulnerable positions. Low squadron, trail element, anywhere German fighters loved to hunt. The YB-40 wasn't meant to lead. It was meant to guard the weak points. And in theory, that meant it would do the most important job in the entire formation. Stop the attacks that turned bombers into burning confessions. Hartwell strapped in, looked around at his crew, and felt something he didn't say out loud. Excitement, fear, and a kind of hope he didn't trust. At 1:25 p.m., Hartwell started the engines. 4 Wright Cyclones rumbled to life like a giant, waking up angry. The control tower cleared them for takeoff. Hedgehog rolled down the runway with the 168 other B-17s following. And right away, the difference was obvious. Acceleration felt sluggish. The yoke felt heavy. Not just physically heavy, but heavy like the aircraft didn't want to be told what to do. Standard B-17Fs climbed to 20,000 feet in about 25 minutes. The YB-40 needed almost double. And as Hedgehog climbed, Morrison watched the gauges with that quiet, professional stare that never forgives bad engineering. Fuel consumption ran higher than briefed, because weight demands power. Power demands fuel. And every extra minute spent climbing was another minute for German radar to point fighters toward the bomber stream. Still, the formation pushed toward France. The sky was crowded with engines and vapor trails, and the sense of shared fate. And somewhere in that massive, moving city of metal, Hartwell felt the mission's central fantasy. If the bombers could protect themselves, then maybe the war could be fought on different terms. The formation reached the French coast around 3:30 p.m. Flak bursts dotted the sky in dark, puffed blossoms. The radio crackled with chatter. German fighters were scrambling. Hartwell's crew called out contrails, bearing and altitude, like men reading omens. At 4:02 p.m., Saint-Nazaire appeared through broken clouds. The bombers opened their bays and became what they were built to be. They dropped. The bombs fell. The city below flashed with violence. And then the bombers did the thing that would doom the YB-40. They turned for home. Because the moment a bomber drops its payload, It changes. It becomes lighter. It becomes faster. It climbs more easily. It accelerates better. A B-17 that took off heavy and vulnerable becomes, after the drop, a sleeker machine. But the YB-40? The YB-40 dropped nothing. It still carried thousands of pounds of guns, ammunition, armor, and extra turret machinery. It still carried its burden. So when the formation began to climb and accelerate for the return, the flying destroyer felt the gap open under its wheels like a trap. Hartwell pushed throttles forward, maximum continuous power. He watched airspeed. He watched the bomber stream ahead begin to stretch. The standard B-17s were pulling away at around 160. Hedgehog managed 148. Then Morrison pointed to the gauge. Number 3, cylinder head temperature, was climbing into the red. The extra drag and weight made the Cyclones work harder than they were designed for. And the engines were not impressed by ambition. Morrison throttled back number 3 to prevent overheating. The speed dropped again, 142. Hartwell stared forward. The formation was 3 miles ahead, then 4. The YB-40s were all in the same position now, assigned to guard the vulnerable, but becoming the vulnerable, and right on schedule. The predators noticed. The radio operator in the waist called out contrails. 4 o'clock high. 6 aircraft, maybe 8. Focke-Wulf 190s. Hunting stragglers. Hartwell keyed the intercom. All gunners, track targets. You can tell a lot about a weapon by how quickly it makes people behave differently. The moment the YB-40's gunners began tracking, the aircraft felt alive. Turrets moved, ammunition fed. Men became parts of a single machine designed for one purpose. The first Focke-Wulf dove from 5 o'clock, range 1,200 yards. Tail gunner opened fire at 800. Tracers walked toward the diving fighter. The German pilot broke left and climbed away without firing. The second attack came from 11 o'clock high. 2 Focke-Wulfs in trail. The chin turret tracked the lead aircraft and fired a burst. And for a moment, one clean, perfect moment, the YB-40 looked like the future. Rounds stitched across the FW-190's engine cowling. Black smoke poured out. The fighter rolled inverted and dove toward the channel. A kill, claimed, shouted, believed. The second fighter broke off. Then another attack started, then another. And for 6 minutes, the flying destroyer's firepower worked exactly as designed. Overlapping fields of fire created a wall no pilot wanted to penetrate. A bomber had become a threat, not a victim. But while the gunners were winning, Hedgehog was slowing down. The formation was now 6 miles ahead, then 7. Hartwell could barely see the bomber stream against the afternoon sky, and Morrison delivered the sentence that mattered more than any kill claim. Fuel state. They had burned far more than briefed during climb and combat. At current power settings, they had roughly 90 minutes to reach Alconbury. The formation would be on the ground in 70. Hartwell understood what that meant. It meant the concept wasn't just shaky. It was failing in real time. Another pair of Focke-Wulfs appeared at 2 o'clock. These pilots didn't break off. They circled at distance, watching, waiting. Because the Luftwaffe was not stupid, and German pilots didn't need to be brave to win. They just needed to be patient. They watched the YB-40's speed. They watched it sink away from the protective mass of bombers. They watched it become alone, and once you are alone in the bomber war, you are not a fortress. You are a beacon. The attack came around 4:43 p.m. 3 Focke-Wulfs from different vectors. High right, low left, dead ahead, level. Hartwell couldn't evade. The aircraft turned like a freight train. Slow, stubborn, heavy. So he did the only thing the YB-40 could do. Hold course. Hold altitude. Trust the guns. The gunners opened fire simultaneously. Chin turret forward. Top turret right. Ball turret left. Both waist gunners firing from opposite windows. Spent brass cascaded into the fuselage like metallic rain. The aircraft shook from recoil. It was like riding inside a giant hammer while it hit the sky. One Focke-Wulf's canopy shattered. It rolled and fell away trailing smoke. The high attacker broke off early. But the low attacker pressed in and fired. 20mm cannon rounds punched into Hedgehog's right wing. A hydraulic line severed. Fluid sprayed across the waist window. Right landing gear hydraulics failed. They'd have to manually crank the gear down if they made it home. Fuel check. 72 minutes at current power setting. And the formation, 8 miles ahead, kept pulling away like it didn't even know the experiment was dying behind it. Now Hartwell was alone over occupied France with German fighters circling. And then the radio crackled again. Another YB-40. Captain Richard Hayes, aircraft 425741. He had fallen behind too. 2 flying destroyers now separated from the formation. 2 heavily armed escorts turned into targets. Hayes suggested they form up together. 32 guns were better than 16. Hartwell agreed. Loose formation, mutual defense. It wasn't what the YB-40 was meant to do, but it was what survival demanded. At 5:07 p.m., Hartwell crossed the French coast outbound. The channel stretched gray below like cold metal. 53 miles to England. 41 minutes at current ground speed. Number 3, engine still ran hot. Morrison had already pulled power back twice. Hedgehog began descending. 19,000, 18.8, 18.6. Hayes radioed his number 2 engine oil pressure dropping. He throttled it back. His YB-40 slowed to 138. Both aircraft were struggling. Fuel gauges ticked downward like clocks in a horror film. And then, at 5:22 p.m., 2 Messerschmitt 109s appeared at 6 o'clock high. They followed the stragglers to the channel. They were hunting in the open. Tail gunners called out intercept. Range 400 and closing. Cannons opened fire at 800 yards. Hartwell couldn't climb, couldn't accelerate, couldn't turn hard enough to throw off their aim. The YB-40, built to be an escort, was now a flying target with empty sky all around. Tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Cack, 24 former competition shooter, opened fire first. The lead 109 jinked left and right, dove 20 degrees, then lined up again. At 400 yards, both fighters fired. Cannon shells tore into Hedgehog's tail. One round exploded in the horizontal stabilizer. Another punched through fuselage 2 feet behind Cack's position. The aircraft shuddered. Hartwell felt the controls go mushy. Morrison climbed back to check damage. Elevator cables intact, but the trim tab mechanism jammed. Hartwell would have to fight the yoke all the way home. The Messerschmitts pulled up for another pass. Hayes's YB-40 opened fire with dorsal guns. The combined tracers filled the sky. The Germans broke left and climbed away, temporarily. And then, like a miracle you don't deserve, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts appeared from the northeast. Long-range escorts returning from a sweep. They had heard radio calls about stragglers under attack. They dove at the Messerschmitts. The German pilots turned east toward France. The P-47s didn't pursue. They formed up on both YB-40s, waggled their wings. Escort to the English coast. Hartwell checked fuel. 37 minutes at current power. 29 miles to landfall. Barely enough. And as England rose from the haze, Hartwell felt the concept break in his mind. The YB-40 worked perfectly as a gun platform. It could shred any fighter that got close. The chin turret alone changed frontal attacks. But weight made it useless as an escort. Because after the bombers dropped their payload, the formation became faster. The YB-40 stayed heavy. It stayed slow. It stayed behind. And behind meant hunted. Hayes's number 2 engine seized. Oil pressure 0. He feathered the prop. His YB-40 descended on 3 engines. He wouldn't make Alconbury. Maybe not even England. He aimed for the first airfield he could find. RAF Manston on the Kent Peninsula. Emergency landing. Hartwell watched him peel away. One gunship limping toward safety. Another damaged, barely controllable. At 6:18 p.m., Hedgehog touched down at Alconbury. Hartwell manually cranked the landing gear down. The right main gear locked with seconds to spare. Ground crews counted bullet holes. 1 severed hydraulic line. 1 jammed trim tab. 1 damaged stabilizer. Colonel William Reed waited at the hard stand. He wanted Hartwell's assessment immediately. The first combat test of the flying destroyer, built to protect bomber formations all the way to Germany and back. Hartwell shut down engines, climbed out, hands still shaking from fighting the controls, and he delivered the verdict in 3 words. It can't keep up. That should have ended it. It didn't. Not yet, because war doesn't let go of hope easily. Reed ordered more missions. Maybe this was an anomaly. Maybe different formation positioning would solve the speed problem. Maybe modifications could balance the center of gravity. Maybe. So the program continued. And every mission turned maybe into no. The second mission launched in mid-June. 4 YB-40s flew. All fell behind after bomb drop. Third mission, 11 dispatched. 1 lost. The rest struggled home hours after the main formation landed. Engineers tried modifications, adjusted feeds, changed loading procedures, moved weight forward. Nothing solved the core truth. Because the numbers were merciless. A standard B-17F carrying bombs might weigh around 65,000 pounds at takeoff. After dropping bombs, it might weigh 48,000. That loss of weight turned into speed, climb, survival. The YB-40 weighed heavy at takeoff and stayed heavy after combat. It couldn't drop guns. It couldn't drop ammunition. The very thing that made it the answer made it slow. Then came the most damning statistic. Every single YB-40 fell behind its formation after the drop. Average separation, miles. Average time alone over enemy territory. Long enough for German fighters to make decisions. And German pilots were learning fast. They could see the extra turrets. They could see the aircraft lacked bomb bay doors. They could see it flew in vulnerable positions. They knew what it was. And once they understood it couldn't run, they stopped fearing it. They began preferring it. Because it was a kill you could schedule. They attacked stragglers. And the YB-40 became a straggler by design. By late July, the last missions proved what Hartwell already knew the first day. A heavily armed bomber escort concept failed in the very moment it was supposed to succeed. The program died, and 12 aircraft, expensive, experimental, controversial, were sent back, converted, scrapped, forgotten. No museum preserved them. No restoration project brought them back. They vanished into the post-war world like a rumor. History didn't like to remember them because history prefers victories. And the YB-40 was a defeat you could measure with a stopwatch. If you're enjoying this story, the strange, uncomfortable truth of how war forces people to gamble with engineering, take 2 seconds and hit like. It genuinely helps YouTube push these forgotten stories to more people. And if you want more deep WWII experiments, successes and failures, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rebuilding the hidden side of the war, the prototypes, the dead ends, the inventions that almost worked, and the ones that accidentally changed everything. All right, back to the part history usually skips. What survived the failure? Here is the twist that makes the YB-40 story worth telling. The flying destroyer failed as a system, but inside that failure were 3 ideas that worked brilliantly. And the most important one was mounted at the nose, the chin turret. Engineers studying combat reports noticed something almost embarrassingly clear. Whenever German fighters attacked from the front, YB-40s were able to stop, or at least disrupt, the attack. Because before the chin turret, frontal defense on B-17s was awkward. Cheek guns had limited field of fire. The nose could become a dead zone. German pilots exploited that gap relentlessly, making head-on passes that minimized time exposed to defensive fire and maximized damage. The chin turret sealed the gap. It gave forward coverage. It let a bomber track a fighter coming dead ahead. It turned the Luftwaffe's favorite approach into a more expensive choice. So even though the YB-40 escort concept collapsed, the chin turret design did something rare. It moved from a doomed experiment to production reality. Manufacturers incorporated it. Bombers began arriving with that blunt, aggressive turret under the nose, the silhouette of a lesson learned in blood and fuel burn, and the results were immediate. German pilots who had become comfortable with straight-in attacks suddenly faced concentrated fire they couldn't ignore. They broke off earlier. They took hits at ranges that used to feel safe. They adjusted tactics. And in air war, forcing an enemy to change tactics is often more valuable than one clean kill. But the Chin turret wasn't the only survivor. The YB-40 also introduced staggered waist gun positions, solving the problem of two gunners physically interfering with each other. And it pushed attention toward better tail defense and visibility, ideas that would evolve into late-war tail modifications. 3 improvements from 1 failure. The escort concept died, but the engineering data lived. Because Boeing and Douglas and Vega didn't see the YB-40 purely as a mistake. They saw it as research conducted under the harshest peer review imaginable. Combat. The B-17G became the definitive flying fortress, not because it was perfect, but because it carried the accumulated lessons of everything that had gone wrong before. And on its nose, like a signature, it carried the Chin turret, born from the escort gunship program that couldn't escort. Thousands of bombers rolled off production lines with that turret standardized. New crews walked around it on the hard stands, pointing, asking how it worked, how it tracked, what it could do. And a man like Hartwell, now older by months that felt like years, could explain it with a strange kind of pride. Because he had flown the prototype. He had seen the failure. He had watched German fighters break away when those forward guns spoke. He knew exactly where the turret came from, a pilot asked him once. Maybe joking, maybe not, if the YB-40 was worth it. Worth the money, worth the effort, worth the risk. Worth the crews who flew those 12 aircraft into combat, knowing they would fall behind. And Hartwell looked at the new bomber and understood the ugly beauty of the answer. You don't measure the worth of a failure by how long it survives. You measure it by what it teaches. The YB-40 taught the USAF something that feels obvious now, but wasn't obvious then. Firepower is not free. Every gun is weight. Every belt of ammunition is drag. Every turret is complexity. And complexity kills speed. And speed, when you're trying to stay inside a formation, is survival. So they kept what worked, and they dropped what didn't. They kept the turret. They dropped the escort fantasy. Simple, effective, life-saving. This is where the YB-40 becomes more than an aircraft story. It becomes a debate about how innovation actually happens. Because in movies and documentaries, innovation looks clean. A genius has an idea. The idea is built. It works. Everyone applauds. But the reality, especially in war, is uglier and more honest. Innovation often looks like this. A desperate concept is rushed into existence. It fails publicly. It costs money. It risks lives. And then, quietly, it produces one small piece that changes everything. The YB-40 is a perfect example of fail-forward engineering. Not because failure is good, but because failure is information. The YB-40 gave planners hard data about weight penalties, formation speeds, fuel consumption, and the cruel logic of the return leg. It proved that if you build an escort that can't stay with the escorted, you are building prey. And it also proved that one well-placed defensive system, one turret with the right geometry and field of fire, could reshape enemy behavior. The Luftwaffe didn't stop attacking bombers because the Chin turret existed, but it changed how they attacked. It introduced hesitation. It forced wider approaches. It increased the time they had to spend inside the bomber's defensive envelope. And in a system where small differences decide who burns and who limps home, that mattered. It mattered enough that crews began to notice, then trust, then depend. Hartwell flew more missions in standard B-17Fs. He completed his tour, survived, went home, came back, not to the YB-40, never to the YB-40, but as a training officer, and when the first B-17Gs arrived, he watched crews gather like people around a new religion. They touched the cold metal. They looked into the turret's glass. They asked where it came from, and Hartwell would tell them. He'd tell them about the flying destroyer that couldn't keep up, the gunship that became the target, the 3-month program that died before summer ended. He would tell them about Saint-Nazaire, about watching the bomber stream pull away, about seeing contrails in the sun and realizing the escort had become prey. And then he would point at the chin turret and say, "This survived." And in that moment, the failure turned into something else. Not victory, not heroism, but continuity, a bridge between the men who paid for the lesson and the men who would benefit from it. And that is the kind of story history often forgets, because history is obsessed with the final product, not the broken prototypes, not the dead ends, not the expensive mistakes that made the final product possible. The YB-40 didn't disappear because it was pointless. It disappeared because its purpose was completed the moment it proved the concept wrong. It showed planners that you cannot cheat the physics of escort. You cannot gun your way out of speed. You cannot bolt 16 machine guns onto a bomber and expect it to behave like a fighter. And yet, you can sometimes bolt one critical piece onto a bomber and make it harder to kill. The YB-40's legacy is not the aircraft. It's the extraction of the right idea from the wrong system. It is the art of taking a failure apart and finding the one part that deserves to live. That is what Boeing's engineers did. That is what combat data forced them to do. They kept the turret. They dropped the weight. And the bomber war continued, with crews who had one more chance to come home. If you made it to the end, I want to ask you something. Do you think the YB-40 was a waste or a necessary failure? Drop your answer in the comments, waste or worth it, and tell me why. I read a lot of them, and the debates help shape which stories we cover next. And if you want more WWII stories like this, where the forgotten experiments matter as much as the famous battles, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps these stories reach people who never knew they existed. Because the men who flew those heavy gunships didn't get statues. They didn't get museum exhibits. They got bullet holes, overheated engines, and a program that died in 3 months. But the part that worked, the part that saved lives, lived everywhere. On every bomber nose that faced the enemy head-on, and finally had a way to fight back.